Inside a dark prison cell, an old man calmly reaches for a cup of poison. While his friends dissolve into frantic grief, his composure remains absolute. Here lies the ultimate paradox. The wisest man in Athens, executed by the democracy he served. Welcome to Somnolent. We witness how one man's refusal to stop asking why dismantled the ego of an empire and created the foundation of Western philosophy. The dust of the Athenian morning settles on the steps of the Parthenon, a structure that stands as a silent witness to the peak of human ambition. To walk through the gates of the city in the middle of the 5th century before the Common Era is to step into a world that believes it has reached the summit of civilization. Here, the air is thick with the scent of sea salt from the Piraeus and the heated breath of 10,000 citizens gathered to decide the fate of their world. This is the Golden Age, an era where the human form is perfected in stone, and the human voice is the ultimate weapon of statecraft. In the heart of the city lies the agora. It is more than a marketplace. It is the nervous system of a direct democracy. In this open square, between stalls of dried figs and bolts of linen, the foundations of the modern world are being hammered out in real time. For the Athenian, the highest virtue is public excellence. To be a man of worth is to be beautiful in body and persuasive in speech. The city-state has emerged from the fires of the Persian Wars, not just victorious, but convinced of its own exceptionalism. They have built an empire of islands and tribute, fueled by a navy that dominates the Aegean and an ego that dominates the Greek mind. But with this unrivaled power comes a specific kind of intellectual vanity. The Athenians believe they have the answers because they have the silver and the ships. In this atmosphere of supreme confidence, a new class of intellectuals has risen to prominence, the sophists. These are the professional teachers of wisdom, men who claim they can teach any young citizen the art of rhetoric, the ability to make the weaker argument appear the stronger. To a sophist, truth is a secondary concern. The primary goal is victory in the assembly or the law courts. They sell the tools of manipulation as if they were the tools of virtue, charging exorbitant sums to show the sons of the wealthy how to climb the political ladder. To these teachers and their students, language is not a pathway to understanding, but a tool for control. They argue that justice is merely the interest of the stronger, and that morality is a set of conventions that can be bypassed by those clever enough to speak around them. The city is intoxicated by its own cleverness. The marble temples reflect a society that looks at its own image and sees a god. Every play performed in the theater of Dionysus, every debate held on the Pnyx, and every statue carved by Phidias reinforces the idea that Athens is the school of Greece, and its citizens are the masters of reality. Yet beneath this shimmering surface of marble and logic, a dangerous arrogance has taken root. The democracy has become a place where the loudest voice often carries the most weight, and where the crowd's emotion is easily swayed by a well-turned phrase. The pursuit of wisdom has been replaced by the pursuit of influence. It is a world of certainty, where everyone knows their place, everyone knows their gods, and everyone knows that Athens is the center of the universe. It is a society that values the answer far more than the question. Into this theater of pride walks a man who will challenge the very core of this certainty. He does not wear the fine robes of the sophists, nor does he take their fees. He walks barefoot through the same dusty agora, watching the politicians and the poets, observing the craftsmen and the orators. He sees a city that is rich in silver, but poor in self-reflection. While the sophists claim to teach everything, this man will soon claim to know nothing at all. This simple admission will become the most radical act in the history of Athens, a tiny crack in the marble facade that will eventually bring the entire weight of the empire down upon his shoulders. The stage is set for a confrontation between the polished rhetoric of the elite and the jagged, uncomfortable truth of a single, questioning mind. That weight began as a tremor, a shift in the way one man walked the marble-paved streets of a city obsessed with perfection. To understand the friction between Socrates and Athens, one must first understand what Athens valued. This was a society of the gaze. It was a culture that celebrated the ideal form, where physical beauty was seen as a direct reflection of inner virtue. The statues of the time, the gleaming bronze and white marble, depicted men with symmetrical features, athletic builds, and an effortless poise. But when Socrates walked into the agora, the central marketplace and the beating heart of Athenian life, he broke that visual harmony. He was, by all contemporary accounts, remarkably unattractive. He had a snub nose with flared nostrils, eyes that seemed to bulge and wander, and thick, protruding lips. While his peers spent their fortunes on fine linens and their hours in the gymnasiums perfecting their physiques, Socrates was indifferent to the body. He went barefoot in every season, even across the frozen ground of military campaigns. He wore the same tattered single garment year-round, looking more like a beggar or a satyr than a respected citizen of a great empire. This was not a calculated performance of poverty. It was a profound lack of interest in the material world. He was a man who looked at the luxuries of the markets and famously remarked how many things there were in the world that he did not want. This peculiar man might have lived out his days as a local curiosity, a harmless eccentric of the streets, if not for a journey taken by his friend Chaerephon. Driven by a restless curiosity, Chaerephon traveled to the slopes of Mount Parnassus, to the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi. At the center of this world stood the oracle, a priestess who spoke the will of the gods through cryptic utterances. Chaerephon asked a single, bold question: is anyone wiser than Socrates? The answer that came back from the depths of the temple was unambiguous. The oracle declared that no one was wiser. When this news reached Socrates back in Athens, it did not provide him with a sense of pride. Instead, it triggered a crisis of faith and logic. He knew himself to be a man of no particular brilliance. He felt he possessed no special knowledge, no hidden secrets of the universe, and certainly no expertise that would warrant such a divine superlative. He suspected the god was speaking in a riddle, as the oracle often did. To solve it, he decided he had to prove the god wrong. He set out on a mission to find someone, anyone who was truly wise, believing that by bringing a superior mind to the attention of the oracle, he could clarify the divine intent. He began his search among the leaders of the city, the politicians who spoke with such authority on justice and the management of the state. But as Socrates questioned them, the facade of their knowledge crumbled. They could use grand words, but they could not define the very concepts they claimed to master. He moved on to the poets, the men who wrote the great tragedies and hymns that moved the Athenian soul. He found that while their work was beautiful, they created it through a kind of divine instinct rather than a rational understanding. When asked to explain the meaning behind their verses, they were as lost as any common laborer. Finally, he turned to the craftsmen, the potters and blacksmiths. These men did possess a real technical wisdom. They knew how to shape clay and temper steel. But because they were masters of a trade, they falsely believed they were also masters of politics, ethics, and the nature of the soul. Their small slice of knowledge blinded them to their massive ignorance. Slowly, the weight of the oracle's words began to sink in. Socrates realized that in every encounter he had found men who believed they knew things that they did not actually know. He, at least, was aware of his own lack of knowledge. This was the birth of what would become known as Socratic ignorance. He was the wisest man in Athens not because he held the most information, but because he was the only one who recognized the boundaries of his own mind. He concluded that his mission was to serve the god by showing others the same truth. He would spend the rest of his life as a gadfly, stinging the lazy horse of Athens into a state of awareness, teaching anyone who would listen that the beginning of wisdom is the admission that I know nothing. To understand how this admission of ignorance became a revolutionary force, one must follow Socrates out of the shadows of his own mind and into the blinding heat of the Athenian marketplace. He did not hold court in a secluded academy or charge a fee for his wisdom. Instead, he occupied the agora, the beating heart of the city, where the smells of roasted meat, salted fish, and sweat mingled with the loud commerce of a Mediterranean empire. This was his laboratory. He was a man of the people, yet he was also their most relentless irritant. He didn't offer answers, he offered questions that acted like a surgical knife, cutting through the layers of tradition, ego, and unexamined habit that defined Athenian life. He would spot a man of high standing, perhaps a decorated general like Laches, fresh from the front lines, and engage him in what seemed like casual conversation, but the trap was already set. Socrates would ask about the very thing the man was supposed to embody. "General, you are a man of war," he might say. "Surely you can tell me, what is courage?" The general, confident in his status, would offer a simple definition. Courage is never retreating from the enemy. But Socrates would gently push back. What about the Scythian cavalry who fight by retreating and circling back? Or the Spartans at Plataea, who used a tactical withdrawal to break the Persian line? The general's definition would crumble. He would try again, and Socrates would find another hole and another, until the great man of war stood in the middle of the crowded street, stammering, unable to define the very virtue his entire life was built upon. This was the elenchus, the Socratic cross-examination. It was not a debate to be won, but a process of stripping away the illusions of knowledge to reach the bedrock of truth. He took this same relentless curiosity to the doorsteps of the religious authorities. He met Euthyphro, a man who claimed to have a direct line to the divine, and asked him a question that still echoes through the halls of philosophy. Is the holy loved by the gods because it is holy? Or is it holy because it is loved by the gods? It was a logical pincer movement. By the time Socrates was finished, the priest's certainties were reduced to dust, leaving him frustrated and exposed before the watching public. To the onlookers, this was a spectacle. Socrates called himself a gadfly, and he described Athens as a large, well-bred, but sluggish horse. A horse of such size needs a sting to keep it from falling into a terminal sleep. He saw it as his God-given mission to be that sting. He wanted to provoke the city into thinking, to force it to examine its soul before it lost its way in the pursuit of wealth and imperial power. He was the constant buzz in the ear of the establishment, the reminder that their prestige was often a mask for profound intellectual emptiness. But while the powerful grew red-faced with indignation, a different reaction was taking hold among the younger generation. The sons of the Athenian aristocracy were mesmerized. They didn't see a nuisance, they saw a hero who spoke truth to power using nothing but logic.
Among them was a young man named Aristocles, better known to history by his nickname, Plato. He watched as Socrates dismantled the old guard, fascinated by the way his teacher could turn a man's own words against him. Beside him was Xenophon, a future soldier and historian who saw in Socrates a model of self-discipline and integrity that surpassed any general he had ever met. These young men followed Socrates through the streets like a shadow cabinet of the mind. They imitated his style, they practiced his method, and they began to question their own father's values. This was where the real danger began to brew. For the elders of Athens, it was one thing to be embarrassed in public by a barefoot eccentric. It was quite another to see their own children laughing at that embarrassment and adopting the same skeptical attitude toward the traditions of the city. The resentment was no longer a flicker. It was a slow-burning fire. The experts, the politicians, the poets, and the craftsmen had been humiliated. They had been shown that they did not know what they claimed to know. In a city that prided itself on its democratic wisdom and its glorious history, Socrates was revealing a hollow core. He was making enemies of the men who sat in the high seats of the assembly, the men who controlled the courts, and the men who guarded the city's gods. The gadfly had stung the horse too many times, and the horse was beginning to kick back. The magnetic appeal he held for the youth was being reframed by his enemies as a poisonous influence, a corruption of the very future of Athens. The stage was being set for a confrontation that the city's fragile ego could not avoid, as the curiosity of the philosopher collided head-on with the pride of the state. This pride was soon tested by the brutal machinery of the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that did more than just drain the city's coffers. It hollowed out its soul. For nearly 30 years, the Greek world was locked in a struggle that pitted the democratic sea power of Athens against the austere land power of Sparta. This was not a distant war fought on remote frontiers, but a grinding, intimate catastrophe. Athenians watched from their city walls as their olive groves were burned and their farms looted. They huddled together in the heat of summer, only to be decimated by a plague that took their greatest leaders and left the survivors desperate and paranoid. By the time the war ended in 404 BC, Athens was a shadow of its former self, its empire stripped away, and its fleet destroyed. The loss was total, and the trauma was deep. In the wake of such a collapse, the public's tolerance for intellectual dissent evaporated. The spotlight of public resentment began to find a focus in the figures who had emerged from the circle surrounding Socrates. Chief among them was Alcibiades, perhaps the most brilliant, charismatic, and ultimately destructive figure in Athenian history. He was a man of immense wealth and staggering beauty, a gifted orator who could sway the assembly with a single speech. He was also Socrates' most famous and controversial pupil. Their relationship was the subject of endless gossip. They had shared a tent on the battlefield and saved each other's lives in retreat. In the early days, the association seemed like a testament to the philosopher's influence, the ability of a master of logic to tame the wildest spirit in Athens. But as the war progressed, Alcibiades' ambition proved uncontrollable. He led the city into a disastrous military campaign in Sicily. Then, facing charges of sacrilege at home, he defected to the enemy. He gave the Spartans the very strategies they needed to defeat his own people. Later, he fled to the Persians, playing all sides against each other for his own gain. To the citizens of Athens, Alcibiades was a monster of their own making, and many began to ask who had shaped his mind. They looked at the man who had taught him to question everything, to challenge traditional morality, and to value individual intellect above the laws of the state. The stain of association did not end with the traitors abroad. It was compounded by the tyrants at home. Following the final surrender, Sparta imposed a puppet government on Athens, a group of 30 oligarchs who would come to be known as the 30 Tyrants. This was a dark chapter of purging and bloodletting. In just 8 months, this regime executed more Athenians than the Spartans had killed in the final decade of the war. They confiscated property, silenced dissent, and turned the city into a police state. The leader of this bloody junta was Critias, a man of profound intellect and cold-blooded pragmatism. Critias was not just a politician, he was a poet, a philosopher, and another prominent member of the Socratic circle. When democracy was finally restored after a brief but violent civil war, a general amnesty was declared. It was illegal to prosecute anyone for crimes committed during the reign of the 30. However, the anger did not vanish. It merely changed form. The public could not touch Critias or the other oligarchs who had died in the fighting, but they could look at the teacher who remained in the marketplace.
The logic was simple and devastating. If the students were vipers, what was the nature of the man who raised them? This was the birth of the guilt by association that would eventually seal Socrates' fate. He had stayed in the city during the reign of the 30, and though he had refused to participate in their crimes, he had not fled with the democratic exiles. His silence was interpreted as complicity, and his teachings were viewed as a corrosive acid that had eaten away at the civic virtues of the youth. The atmosphere in the agora shifted. The playful irony that had once been the hallmark of Socratic dialogue now felt like a hidden weapon. Every question about the nature of justice felt like a jab at the fragile new democracy. Every time he asked a young man to define piety or courage, the bystanders didn't just hear a philosopher, they heard a man who had potentially paved the road for the city's destruction. The intellectual curiosity that had defined the Golden Age was now seen as a luxury the city could no longer afford. Athens was a wounded animal, and it was looking for a scapegoat to carry the weight of its failures. The Gadfly was no longer just a nuisance, he was becoming a threat to the very survival of the state. The stage was no longer set for a debate, but for a reckoning. This reckoning did not begin in a courtroom or a dark alley, but on the brightly lit stage of the great Dionysia festival. To understand how a man who spent his life seeking truth became a man the city wanted dead, we must look to the power of the comic poets. In 423 BC, the playwright Aristophanes produced a comedy titled The Clouds. It was a biting, brilliant satire that transformed the eccentric Socrates into a caricature of everything the average Athenian feared and loathed. On stage, the actor playing Socrates was suspended in a basket, hanging between heaven and earth, claiming he needed to be closer to the sky to better study the celestial bodies. Aristophanes portrayed him as the head of a thinkery, a dilapidated school where students were taught how to make the weaker argument defeat the stronger. This was the hallmark of the sophists, intellectual mercenaries who charged high fees to teach the youth how to use rhetoric to win debates regardless of the truth. Socrates, in reality, never charged a drachma and claimed to know nothing at all, yet in the public imagination, the distinction vanished.
The Socrates of the stage was a man who investigated things beneath the earth and in the heavens, a man who replaced the traditional gods of Olympus with his own eccentric deities, like the clouds and the tongue. The damage done by this play cannot be overstated. While Socrates laughed at his own depiction, standing up in the theater so the audience could compare his face to the mask on stage, the laughter of the crowd was not harmless. It planted a seed. For 24 years, this image of the philosopher as a dangerous, atheistic subverter of tradition fermented in the minds of the Athenian people. The children who grew up watching the clouds were the same men who would eventually sit on the jury of 501. To them, the caricature had calcified into a fact. By the time he was actually called to court, he was not being judged for his current actions, but for a reputation that had been etched into the city's consciousness decades earlier. But satire alone does not lead to an execution. It took a catastrophe to turn a nuisance into a scapegoat. The Athens of Socrates' youth had been an empire at its zenith, wealthy and confident, but by the end of the 5th century, that confidence had been shattered. The Peloponnesian War against Sparta had dragged on for nearly 30 years, ending in a humiliating defeat for the Athenians. Their walls were torn down to the sound of Spartan flutes, their navy was dismantled, and their cherished democracy was briefly replaced by a brutal Spartan-backed oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants. This period of rule was a bloodbath. The tyrants executed 1,500 prominent citizens and drove thousands more into exile. When the democracy was finally restored, the city was a shell of its former self. It was a city living in the shadow of its own trauma, insecure, paranoid, and desperately looking for someone to blame for its sudden fall from grace. They looked for a source of the moral rot that they believed had angered the gods and led to their defeat. Socrates was the most visible target. He was a man who stayed in the city during the reign of the tyrants. Worse, several of his most prominent associates and former students had been instrumental in the city's ruin. Critus, the bloodiest of the 30 tyrants, had been a follower of Socrates.
Alcibiades, the brilliant but reckless general who had betrayed Athens to Sparta, had been Socrates' most beloved companion. To the average citizen, the connection was obvious. Socrates was the teacher of traitors. His constant questioning of the city's laws and traditional virtues was no longer seen as a quest for wisdom. It was seen as the intellectual foundation for the arrogance and impiety that had brought Athens to its knees. The city needed to be purified. They needed a ritual cleansing, an act of piety to signal to the gods that the old ways were being restored. The charge was officially brought forward by a poet named Meletus, a tanner named Anytus, and a rhetorician named Lycon. The indictment was simple. Socrates is guilty of refusing to recognize the gods recognized by the state and of introducing new divinities. He is also guilty of corrupting the youth. Behind these formal words lay the weight of a generation's worth of resentment, fear, and grief. The man who had spent 70 years walking the agora, trying to wake his fellow citizens from their moral slumber, was now being called to answer for the very survival of the Athenian soul. The stage was set. The indictment was posted in the heart of the city. The Gadfly had finally been cornered, and the trial that would change the course of Western history was about to begin. The formal document of the indictment, known as the antigraph, was more than a legal summons. It was a death warrant signed by the fragile ego of a recovering democracy. For weeks, the people of Athens had gathered around the royal stoa, whispering as they read the words inscribed on the whitened tablet. The air in the city felt heavy,
charged with the static of a brewing storm. This was not merely a dispute between neighbors or a common criminal case. It was a reckoning for the soul of the city-state. As the morning sun crested the Acropolis, illuminating the marble temples that Socrates had spent a lifetime questioning, the actors in this tragedy took their places. The man leading the charge was Miletus, a young poet with long, lank hair and a thin beard. To many, he was an unlikely protagonist for such a monumental trial. He was a man of modest talent, perhaps driven by a desire for the fame that his poetry had failed to provide. But Miletus was merely the face of the operation. Behind him stood the true architect of the prosecution, Anytus. A powerful politician and a hero of the democratic restoration, Anytus was a man of iron conviction. He had suffered under the brief, bloody reign of the 30 tyrants, and in his mind, Socrates was the intellectual spark that had lit the fire of that tyranny. Anytus didn't just want Socrates silenced, he wanted the city purged of the man he blamed for the corruption of his own son and the destabilization of the Athenian way of life. Completing this trio was Lycon, a professional orator. Lycon was the master of the spoken word, a man who understood how to pull at the heartstrings and ignite the prejudices of a crowd. Together, they represented the 3 pillars of the Athenian establishment: the arts, the state, and the power of rhetoric. The charges they brought forward were calculated to hit the most sensitive nerves of the public. First, they accused Socrates of impiety, claiming he failed to acknowledge the gods recognized by the city, and instead introduced new, strange divinities. In a world where the favor of the gods was the only thing standing between Athens and another devastating plague or military defeat, this was an accusation of spiritual treason. The second charge was more personal and far more dangerous: corrupting the youth. The accusers argued that Socrates' method of questioning had stripped the young men of Athens of their respect for authority, their fathers, and the traditions that held the city together. To the grieving parents of a city that had recently lost a generation to war and civil strife, this was a terrifying prospect. The setting for this confrontation was the Heliastic Court, a sprawling open-air space where the theater of law played out before the masses. This was not a trial by a panel of impartial judges, but a trial by the people. 501 citizens, all over the age of 30, had been chosen by lot to serve as the jury. This odd number was a deliberate safeguard, ensuring there could never be a tie. These men were not legal experts. They were farmers, potters, shopkeepers, and soldiers. They brought with them the collective trauma of a city that had been brought to its knees by Sparta only 5 years prior. They sat on tiered wooden benches, their faces etched with the weariness of a decade of chaos. In this legal system, the rules were stark. There were no professional defense attorneys to shield the accused, no cross-examinations conducted by legal scholars, and no strict rules of evidence. Socrates would have to stand on a raised platform, alone, and speak directly to the 501 men who held his life in their hands. His only companion was the clepsydra, the water clock. As the water dripped from one clay vessel to another, it marked the relentless passage of his allotted time. Once the water ran out, his voice would be silenced, and the jury would cast their votes. The atmosphere in the court was electric, a mixture of a religious festival and a public execution. The jury did not sit in silence. They were known to shout, jeer, and interrupt the speaker if they disagreed with his points. It was a brutal, visceral form of justice. The stakes of this moment extended far beyond the life of one elderly philosopher. This was a culture war in its purest form. It was a clash between the ancient, unyielding traditions of the fathers and the radical, piercing light of individual reason. On one side stood the safety of the status quo, the comfort of the old myths, and the stability of the collective. On the other stood a man who insisted that the unexamined life was not worth living, even if that examination tore the very fabric of society apart. As Meletus stepped forward to read the indictment, the crowd fell into a temporary expectant hush. The Gadfly had been trapped in the web of the law, and the city watched with bated breath to see if he would sting or if he would finally be crushed. The trial of Socrates was about to transcend the boundaries of a courtroom and become a permanent scar on the history of civilization. The indictment was read, the water began to drip, and the most famous defense in the history of the world was about to begin.
The water clock, the clepsydra, marks the heartbeat of the Athenian legal system. As the liquid drains from one vessel to another, it measures the life of the accused with the steady, indifferent rhythm of falling drops. Socrates stands before a sea of 500 citizen jurors, men he has known, taught, or provoked for decades. This is not a courtroom in the modern sense. It is a political theater, a public reckoning held in the open air. Most defendants in this position would arrive in rags, weeping openly, dragging their wives and children before the assembly to trigger a primal sense of pity. They would beg for their lives. They would use the polished, manipulative rhetoric of the sophists to charm the crowd. But Socrates begins by telling the jury that he is not a good speaker, at least not in the way they expect. He tells them he will not use the linguistic tricks of the trade. He will simply tell the truth in the same plain, unadorned language he uses at the tables of the money changers in the market. He addresses the core of the resentment that has simmered against him for years. He knows he is not just fighting the specific charges of Meletus, but a lifetime of rumors and a public image shaped by satirical plays and local gossip. He explains that his reputation for a strange kind of wisdom started not with a desire for power, but with a riddle from the heavens. His friend Chaerephon once went to the oracle at Delphi and asked the priestess if there was anyone wiser than Socrates. The answer from the god was a definitive no. Socrates tells the jury that this news did not fill him with pride, but with a deep existential confusion. He knew he possessed no great knowledge. To understand the meaning of the god's words, he began a journey that turned him into the man they see today. He went to the politicians, the poets, and the craftsmen, men who claimed to hold the keys to truth. He found that while they were skilled in their trades, they all believed they knew things they did not. In showing them their own ignorance through his relentless questioning, he realized that perhaps his wisdom lay in this single humble fact. He knew that he knew nothing. This, he argues, is not a hobby or a nuisance, but a divine mission. He is a soldier for the truth, and he refuses to desert his post. He tells the jurors that he is a gift to the city, a gadfly sent by the gods to stir the great well-bred but sluggish horse of Athens from its moral sleep. If they kill him, he warns, they will not easily find another to take his place. He describes his inner voice, his daimonion, which has guided him since childhood, preventing him from entering the corrupting world of politics and keeping him on the path of private inquiry. He is not a teacher for hire. He is a man fulfilling a mandate. He even turns his poverty into evidence of his sincerity, pointing to his threadbare cloak as proof that he has never sought a drachma for his conversations. The cross-examination of his accuser, Meletus, is not a plea for mercy, but a clinical dissection.
Socrates traps the younger man in a web of logical contradictions, forcing him to admit that he believes Socrates is both a total atheist and a man who introduces new gods.
The jury murmurs as the logic of the prosecution begins to fray, but logic is rarely a match for long-standing prejudice. When the time comes for the first vote, the jurors place their bronze discs into the urns. The count is remarkably close. In a jury of 500, Socrates is found guilty by a margin of only 30 votes. Had a handful of men changed their minds, the philosopher would have walked free. Under Athenian law, the trial now enters a second phase, the sentencing. Meletus, as expected, proposes the penalty of death. Socrates is then invited to propose a counter-penalty. This is the moment where the trial could have ended in a compromise. If Socrates had suggested a heavy fine or a quiet retirement into exile, the jury likely would have accepted it, relieved to have the old man out of their sight without having his blood on their hands. But Socrates does not seek a compromise with his principles. He looks at the men who have just branded him a criminal and tells them that since he has spent his entire life working for the benefit of the city, neglecting his own wealth and family to improve the souls of his fellow citizens, he deserves a reward. He proposes that he be given free meals for the rest of his life in the Prytaneum, the prestigious hall reserved for Olympic victors and the city's most celebrated heroes. The atmosphere in the court shifts instantly from legal tension to blinding collective rage. To the Athenian jurors, this is not just arrogance, it is a calculated mockery of the democratic process. They had offered him an exit, a way to save face while acknowledging their authority, and he responded by demanding the highest honors the state could bestow. It is an act of supreme intellectual defiance. He is telling them that their judgment is irrelevant in the face of the truth. When the second vote is taken to decide between the proposal of death and Socrates' proposal of a reward, the margin is no longer close. Men who had previously voted for his innocence now, out of pure indignation, vote for his execution. The jury decides for death by a significantly wider margin than the initial vote of guilt. Socrates accepts the verdict with a chilling, almost supernatural calm. He does not rail against the injustice or curse his accusers. Instead, he speaks to those who voted for him and those who voted against him with the same detached curiosity he brought to the marketplace. He tells the jurors that the difficulty is not to escape death, which catches up with everyone in the end, but to escape wickedness, for wickedness runs faster than death. He suggests that those who voted for his execution will suffer a far worse fate than he will. They will be remembered as the men who killed a wise man, while he will pass into the unknown with his integrity intact. He muses about the nature of death, wondering if it is a dreamless sleep or a journey to another place where he can continue his questioning of the great heroes of the past. As the sun begins to dip lower in the sky and the trial concludes, his final words hang over the assembly like a prophecy. He tells them that the hour of departure has arrived, and they go their separate ways, he to die, and they to live. Which of these is better, he concludes, is known only to God. The trial is over, but the transformation of Socrates from a local nuisance into a global martyr has just begun. He is led away in chains, leaving a city that has just committed a legal suicide, trading its greatest thinker for a brief, vengeful moment of silence. The iron gates of the state prison close with a finality that echoes through the narrow streets of Athens, marking the transition from the public chaos of the trial to the suffocating quiet of a stone cell. For most men, this would be the end of the story, a period of desperate prayer or hollow silence. But for Socrates, this interval is not a countdown to extinction.
It is the final laboratory for his ideas. A peculiar ritual of the Athenian state has granted him a temporary reprieve. Each year, a sacred ship is sent to Delos to honor Apollo, and by ancient law, no executions can take place until the vessel returns. The city sits in a state of religious purity, while its most controversial citizen sits in chains, waiting for the wind to change. The darkness of the cell is broken long before the sun rises over the Aegean. A heavy latch turns, and a familiar figure slips inside. It is Crito, a man of great wealth and even greater devotion to the teacher who has shaped his life. Crito has spent the night coordinating a network of friends and arranging the necessary bribes. The guards have been paid, the mountain passes to the north are open, and a safe haven in Thessaly is prepared. To Crito, the situation is simple. The trial was a farce, the verdict was a mistake, and the execution would be a murder. There is no moral obligation to submit to an unjust death when the means of survival are sitting in a bag of silver on the floor. Crito's plea is fueled by a desperate human urgency. He speaks of the shame that will fall upon Socrates' friends if they allow him to die, the mockery of his enemies who will claim he was too cowardly to save himself, and the duty he owes to his young sons who will be left fatherless. He begs the old man to listen to reason, to recognize that the state has broken its side of the bargain by condemning an innocent man. But Socrates does not move. He sits on the edge of his stone bench, listening to his friend's frantic whispers with the same detached curiosity he used to examine a merchant's logic in the marketplace. Instead of reaching for his sandals, Socrates begins a dialogue. He asks Crito to set aside his emotions and look at the facts of the soul. He poses a question that cuts through the panic of the moment. Is it ever right to return a wrong with another wrong? Crito hesitates, and Socrates presses further. He invites Crito to imagine the laws of Athens standing before them in the cell. These personified laws speak with a collective voice, reminding Socrates of everything they have provided. They birthed him, they educated him, they protected his family, and they gave him the freedom to live as he chose for 70 years. By remaining in Athens all his life, Socrates entered into a silent, binding contract. He accepted the benefits of the city, and in doing so, he accepted its authority. The laws ask him a devastating question. What happens to a city if its legal decisions have no power? If every man who felt he was treated unfairly simply walked away, the structure of civilization would dissolve into nothingness. Socrates realizes that to run now would be to commit the very crime he was accused of, being a corrupter of society. If he flees to Thessaly, he becomes a common fugitive, a hypocrite who preached virtue for decades only to discard it the moment his own skin was at risk. He would be validating the jury's decision, proving that he is, in fact, an enemy of the order that sustained him. He explains to a weeping Crito that the integrity of his philosophy is more valuable than the blood in his veins. To die as a victim of an unjust application of the law is a tragedy, but to live as a man who destroyed the law itself is a catastrophe. He chooses to remain, not out of a desire for death, but out of a profound loyalty to the idea of the citizen. He will not trade his soul for a few more years of breathing in a foreign land. He will stay and die as an Athenian, proving that a man's principles must be sturdier than the walls of his prison. As the first light of morning filters through the high barred window, the argument is settled. The ship from Delos is sighted off the coast of Cape Sunium. Its white sails are full, and as it nears the harbor, the interval of mercy comes to a close. Socrates washes himself, prepares his mind, and waits for the final cup. leaving Crito to realize that the teacher has just won his most difficult debate. The sun begins to dip toward the jagged horizon of the Attic hills, casting long amber shadows across the stone floor of the prison. The debate is finished. The arguments for the soul's endurance have been laid out like a map, but the silence that follows is heavy, thick with the shared breath of men who are not yet ready for the world to grow cold. Socrates returns from his bath, cleansed for his own funeral rites, and sits among his followers one last time. He does not look like a man facing an end, but like a traveler preparing for a long-awaited voyage. To his friends, the sight is unbearable. They see a father being taken away, leaving them to live out the rest of their lives as orphans in a city that has lost its conscience. He speaks to them of the soul with a strange, magnetic cheerfulness. He reminds them that the body is a cage, a vessel of distractions and appetites that cloud the pursuit of pure wisdom. If a philosopher spends his entire life preparing for the separation of the soul from the flesh, then why should he tremble when the gate finally swings open? He chides Apollodorus for his weeping, his voice gentle but firm, correcting their grief as if it were nothing more than a flawed logical premise. He remains the teacher until the very last grain of sand slips through the glass. The door creaks open, and a man enters. He is not a villain or a hollow-eyed executioner, but a public servant who has grown to love the man he is tasked to kill. He carries a small cup of hammered metal. With a voice thick with genuine sorrow, the officer explains the procedure. There is no violence here, only a quiet chemical transition. You drink, you walk until your legs feel heavy, and then you lie down and wait for the cold to reach your heart. Socrates looks at the man with a steady, inquisitive gaze, asking if he might offer a libation to the gods, a splash of the poison on the floor as a prayer. When the officer explains they have prepared only the exact dose required, Socrates nods, accepting the limitation with a shrug of his shoulders. He offers a spoken prayer instead, asking for a prosperous journey from this world to the next. He takes the cup with a hand that does not shake. There is no hesitation, no lingering look at the sky. He drinks the hemlock with the same ease he might drain a cup of watered wine at a symposium. For a moment, the dam of restraint among his friends breaks. The room is filled with the sound of muffled sobs and the sharp intake of breath. Crito hides his face in his cloak, unable to watch the light fade from his master's eyes. Apollodorus breaks into a loud wail that echoes off the cold stone walls. Socrates, standing in the center of their collapse, remains the only calm element in the room. He asks them what they are doing, reminding them that he sent the women away earlier precisely to avoid such a scene. He tells them he wishes to die in a holy silence, and out of respect for him, they force themselves to be still. He begins to walk. He paces the small cell, his footsteps steady at first, then slowing as the poison begins its work. The spotted hemlock is a patient killer. It starts at the extremities, a creeping numbness that steals the ability to move. He feels his legs grow heavy, the muscles turning to lead, and as he was instructed, he lies down on his back. The executioner steps forward, pressing his hand firmly against Socrates' foot, asking if he feels the pressure. Socrates says no. The man moves his hand up to the legs and then the thighs, showing the friends how the body is becoming cold and stiff. The numbness travels upward toward his middle. Socrates is being turned to marble while he still breathes. Just as the cold reaches his waist, he draws back the shriek that covers his face and looks at Crito. These are not the grand, sweeping words of a martyr or a bitter curse against the jury that condemned him. They are a simple request for the settlement of a debt. Crito, he says, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay it and do not neglect it. To the casual observer, it is a mundane final thought, but to those who know the language of the Greeks, the meaning is profound. Asclepius was the god of healing, and it was the custom to offer a sacrifice to him after recovering from a long and grueling illness. By asking for this offering, Socrates is telling his friends that life itself was the malady, a period of sickness and confusion for the soul. Death is not the end of his existence, but the cure for it. He is finally being healed of the human condition. Crito asks if there is anything else, but there is no answer. A few moments pass in the stillness of the cell. There is a slight stir under the shroud, a final reflexive movement of the nerves. The executioner uncovers him. His eyes are fixed, staring into a distance that none of the living can see. Crito reaches out and with a trembling hand closes his mouth and his eyes. The gadfly of Athens is still. The voice that challenged an empire of thought has been silenced, but the questions he planted in the soil of the city are already beginning to take root. Socrates has left the cave, and for those left behind, the world feels suddenly, terrifyingly dark. The silence that followed the final breath of Socrates was not the peace of a job well done, but a heavy, ringing void that settled over the limestone hills of Athens. The darkness mentioned by those who watched him die was not merely a trick of the evening light, it was a psychological eclipse. The city had finally swatted the gadfly, but in the sudden quiet that followed, the citizens began to hear the echo of their own judgment. It didn't take long for the fever of the trial to break, replaced by a cold, shivering realization. History suggests that the collective conscience of the city collapsed almost as soon as the hemlock had finished its work. The people of Athens, notoriously fickle and prone to sudden shifts in temperament, were seized by a wave of public remorse so potent it shut down the heart of the city. Gymnasiums were closed, the wrestling grounds fell silent, and a period of official mourning was observed for the very man they had just branded a criminal. But grief, when it is born of guilt, often seeks a target. The Athenian assembly, looking for a way to distance itself from the blood on its hands, turned its fury toward the men who had brought the charges. Meletus, the young poet who had stood in the sun and accused Socrates of corrupting the youth, found that his victory was his death warrant. He was sentenced to death by the same fickle public he had tried to lead. Anytus and Lycon, the other architects of the prosecution, were driven into exile, forced to flee the city to escape the vengeful regret of their neighbors. It was a desperate attempt by the state to scrub the stain from the floor of the jailhouse, but the memory of the cup and the man who drank it remained fixed in the mind of every citizen who walked past the agora. While the city scrambled to rewrite its own narrative, the inner circle of Socrates was undergoing a different kind of dissolution. The men who had spent their days in the dust of the marketplace, locked in the relentless pursuit of truth, were suddenly untethered. Fear of further persecution hung over them like a shroud. If the city could kill the most virtuous man in Greece under the guise of law, then no one who thought like him was safe. They scattered. Some fled to Megara, seeking refuge with Euclides, a fellow student who offered them safety beyond the reach of the Athenian courts. Others retreated into the countryside, hiding their grief and their questions behind closed doors. The movement that Socrates had built, which was never really a movement at all, but a shared habit of mind, seemed on the verge of vanishing into the air. Among these refugees was a young aristocrat named Plato. He was 28 years old, a man of immense physical presence and intellectual pedigree. He had grown up in the shadow of the Peloponnesian War, witnessing the collapse of the Athenian Empire and the brutal, bloody reign of the 30 tyrants. He had seen democracy fail and then return, only to use its restored power to execute his mentor. For Plato, the death of Socrates was the final, definitive proof that the political world was a theater of madness. He had been a man destined for the halls of power, expected by his family and his class to lead the city into its next chapter. But as he watched the hemlock take effect, that path was cauterized. He turned his back on the assembly and the prospect of a political career. He realized that as long as cities were governed by the whims of the many rather than the wisdom of the few, the gadflies would always be executed. Plato's trauma became the catalyst for a monumental shift in human history. He didn't just walk away from politics, he walked toward a new way of preserving the essence of the man he had lost. He began to write. This was a radical act. Socrates had famously avoided the written word, believing that philosophy was a living, breathing interaction that died the moment it was pinned to a page. But Plato saw that if he did not write, Socrates would be forgotten, or worse, redefined by his enemies. He began to construct the Dialogues, a series of literary works where Socrates lived again. In these pages, the old stonecutter returned to the streets of Athens. Plato used his grief to fuel a literary resurrection, creating a version of Socrates that could never be silenced by a cup of poison. However, this act of devotion created a profound mystery that continues to haunt us today. We call it the Socratic problem. Because the real Socrates never wrote a single line of his own philosophy, we are forced to view him through a series of filtered lenses. We see him through the practical, soldierly mind of Xenophon, through the biting satire of the playwright Aristophanes, and most dominantly through the evolving genius of Plato. This leaves us with a haunting question. Where does the historical Socrates end and the Platonic Socrates begin? In the early dialogues, we likely hear the true voice of the gadfly, the man who claimed to know nothing and spent his life proving that others knew even less. But as Plato's own philosophical system grew more complex, he began to use the character of Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own ideas about the world of forms and the nature of the soul. We are left chasing a ghost in a hall of mirrors. We know the physical details, the snub nose, the bulging eyes, the bare feet on the cold stone. We know he could outdrink the strongest men in the city and still outthink its greatest politicians. But the true, unvarnished core of his soul is forever shielded by the very men who loved him enough to write his story. He remains an enigma, a man who became a legend by refusing to leave a trail. The real Socrates dissolved with the hemlock, leaving us only the echoes of his questions and the vast, towering architecture of the thought that his death inspired. The world was suddenly terrifyingly dark, but in that darkness, Plato began to build a new light, one that would illuminate the Western mind for the next 2,000 years. Plato's light was not a single unwavering beam, but a prism that caught the spirit of his teacher and fractured it into a dozen different colors. While the Academy rose as a monument to the ideal, the shadow of the gadfly stretched far beyond its walls, touching every corner of the ancient world and planting seeds in soil that Plato himself would never have walked. The man was gone. His physical presence dissolved into the dust of the potter's quarter, but the vibration of his voice remained, a lingering frequency that refused to be silenced by hemlock. Among those who stood in the wake of the trial was Antisthenes, a man who had seen the master die and decided that the only honest response was a total rejection of the society that had demanded such a sacrifice. He took the Socratic indifference to wealth and status and pushed it to its absolute breaking point, giving birth to the movement of the Cynics. They looked at the ruins of Athenian pride and saw a cage. They saw Socrates not as a polite conversationalist, but as a wild creature who had realized that the only true freedom lay in having nothing left to lose. They lived in the streets, mocked the powerful, and practiced a rugged, visceral self-sufficiency. To them, the Gadfly was a stray dog biting at the heels of a civilization that had traded its soul for silk and stone. From these rough, unwashed beginnings grew something even more enduring. In the shade of the painted Stoa, Zeno of Citium took those same Socratic threads and wove them into the fortress of Stoicism. He looked at the way Socrates had faced his accusers and his end, without flinching, without resentment, and with a mind anchored in the eternal, and he saw a blueprint for human existence. The Stoics realized that if a person could master their own internal landscape, the external world lost its power to cause suffering. They turned the Socratic search for virtue into a daily discipline, a way of standing upright while the world collapsed around them. For centuries, from the slave quarters of Rome to the imperial palace of Marcus Aurelius, the ghost of Socrates served as the ultimate example of the man who could not be conquered because he wanted nothing that the world could take away. Yet the legacy of the Gadfly traveled far beyond the schools of ethics and the porches of philosophers. It seeped into the very foundations of how we understand the physical world, providing the hidden architecture for what we now call the scientific method. Long before the laboratories of the modern age, Socrates gifted us the logic of the hypothesis. He taught us that truth is not something handed down by tradition or decreed by authority, but something that must be tested, stressed, and interrogated until only the undeniable remains. He replaced the arrogance of the absolute statement with the humility of the persistent question. This was the birth of intellectual honesty, the radical idea that we must be willing to strip away everything we think we know to find the hard, cold reality underneath. Every time a modern researcher questions a variable or a scientist seeks to disprove their own most cherished theory, they are practicing the Socratic elenchus. They are working in the tradition of the man who knew that the beginning of wisdom is the admission of ignorance. In our own era, the buzz of the Gadfly has never been more vital, and yet it has never felt more distant.
We live in an age of total certainty, a digital landscape where every voice is amplified and every opinion is a fortress. We are surrounded by the modern heirs of the sophists, masters of persuasion, who value the win over the truth, who use the tools of rhetoric to build walls rather than bridges. The unexamined life has become a global standard, fueled by the convenience of the algorithm and the seductive comfort of the echo chamber. It is safer to repeat a slogan than it is to examine the foundation of one's own beliefs. We have forgotten the sting of the Gadfly because we have surrounded ourselves with the padding of consensus. But the message of Socrates remains as sharp as it was 24 centuries ago. He reminds us that the most dangerous person in the room is not the one who is wrong, but the one who is certain.
He calls to us across the ages, insisting that the health of a soul and the health of a democracy depend on the courage to be uncomfortable. He demands that we look at our lives, our work, and our loves, and ask if they are built on our own convictions or merely the inherited habits of a crowd. To follow him is to accept a terrifying responsibility, the realization that your mind is your own, and its cultivation is the only task that truly matters. Socrates was not a man who had the answers. He did not leave behind a holy book, a system of laws, or a map of the heavens. He left something much more powerful, a way of being. He showed us that the pursuit of wisdom is not a destination to be reached, but a posture to be maintained. He was a man who taught us that the question is more sacred than the answer, and that the search for truth is more valuable than the possession of it. He was the eternal outsider, the man who refused to fit, the one who realized that a life without inquiry is a life lived in a dream. The wind now sweeps through the empty foundations of the agora, over the stones where he once stood barefoot in the heat of the noon sun. The great temples have lost their gold, the statues have lost their features, and the bustling crowds that once judged him have been reclaimed by the earth. The city succeeded in killing the man, but they could not touch the spark he carried. That spark jumped from the hemlock cup to the heart of Plato, from the streets of Athens to the libraries of the world, and finally into the quiet moments of any individual who dares to stop and think. As the sun sets over the ruins of the marketplace, casting long violet shadows across the birthplace of logic, the silence feels heavy with his presence. The physical world of the Gadfly is gone, but the invitation remains open to anyone willing to listen. The trial is never truly over. In every generation, the voice of the questioner rises again to challenge the slumber of the world. It is a voice that tells us that we are more than our possessions, more than our politics, and more than the stories we are told. It is the voice that reminds us that the journey toward the truth begins with a single, humble, and devastatingly honest question. The screen fades, but the question lingers in the dark, waiting for an answer that only we can provide.